Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome back, everyone, to lecture 13. We are still talking about the figures. And in the last class, we took the four figures and we did it in an abstract way. The normal progression of the discussion is then the following, which is to show that each figure, because it is made of two premises with different qualities that we've mentioned before, depending on the different qualities, when you combine them, they can create a different combination of premises for that figure. What we call the mode in the Latin understanding of the of logic. It's called the mode. I think Aristotle used that in one of his. I just want to confirm that. Yeah, Aristotle used mode coming from the Latin modus, which means way. And in Arabic, we call it a darb or durub, is when you multiply the possibilities and you have a darb is a schedule of possibilities. Now, when you put all of the combinations of all of the figures together, you can get a total of 256 possibilities. Thank God we're not going to talk about 256 possibilities because most of them don't produce any actual logical results, only a few of them. So for today and tomorrow's lecture, pretty much I think these two lectures will become, I'll be able to cover it all. We are going to talk about the potential possibilities of the first and the second figure. That's today's lecture. Tomorrow we'll do 3 and 4. And luckily, in figure 1 and figure 2, each of them has 4 possibilities each. And I'm not so interested in you learning all of the non-possibilities or the possibilities that don't produce a logical result. You just need to memorize the 4 for each one, and then that's it. And then anything that's not those 4, then you understand that it's not logical for a whole host of reasons. So today's lecture will introduce this idea that there are possibilities. We'll introduce then the conditions for a correct figure 1 and a correct figure 2 logical syllogism. And then therefore we will learn about the 4 manifestations of each kind, the mode or the durub, the darb. And then by default, then you will know that everything that's not that in the combination possibility is not logical. And that's where a lot of people make mistakes in the modern world, is they're actually making illogical arguments, as I've been mentioning. That's the main topic for today. We'll jump into it in the next clip, inshallah. All right. Before we begin, I should mention that we are going to read lines 88, 89, and 90. Those are the lines for today. I forgot to mention that in the introductory clip. So let me do first lines 88 and 89 because they have to do with the first figure. So he says, رضي الله عنه, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Line 88, فحيث عن هذا النظام يعدل ففاسد النظام أما الأول. Whenever one deviates from the sequence of what he mentioned before, meaning the way that the 4 figures are created, then that is an invalid sequence. As for the first, so the first figure, فشرطه الإيجاب في صغراه وأن ترى كلية كبراه. Very simple. Its condition is that for the minor premise, it's affirmative, and the major premise is universal. So let's talk about that. So the first rule that we want to remember and that we want to memorize is that when we're talking about the first figure, and let me go back to the other book for a moment to refresh our memories about the first figure. We said in the first figure, the middle term is the subject of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. So Zayd is a human, is the minor premise. Every human is rational, that's the major premise. So the conclusion is therefore Zayd is rational because you drop the middle premise which is repeated. So for that type of figure, figure 1 of the syllogism, for it to be valid, the 2 conditions are that the minor premise be affirmative and that the major premise be universal. When we put those together, we get 4 possible combinations. So let me give you the theoretical combination with an example. So the minor premise has to be affirmative. So it can be affirmative universal or it can be affirmative particular. But then the major premise has to be universal. So it can be universal affirmative and universal negative. So that's why you have 4 for each. So the first example, I'm going to go minor premise, major premise, conclusion. In English, sometimes or more often, we do the major premise first. But in Arabic, and the examples, and even when I read from the other book, I'm trying to convert it for you so that the minor premise is always first and then the major premise. So the first example in our chart of possibilities that are valid, a valid syllogism of figure 1, is that the minor premise is affirmative universal and then the major premise is affirmative universal. Therefore, the conclusion will be affirmative universal. If I said every human being is an animal and every animal has feelings, therefore every human being has feelings. Okay, so that's a simple one. The second example is that the minor premise is affirmative universal, but then the major premise is negative universal. Therefore, the conclusion will be negative universal. So if I said every human being is articulate and nothing that is articulate is a horse, therefore nothing from the human beings is a horse. The minor premise was affirmative universal, but the major premise was negative universal, so therefore the conclusion is going to be negative universal. The third example is that the minor premise is affirmative particular, and also the major premise is affirmative particular. Therefore, the conclusion will be affirmative particular. This is just the opposite of the first one. So if I said some animals are humans, and then every human being is articulate, the conclusion is therefore some animals are articulate. Some animals are human beings. This is affirmative particular. Every human being is articulate. This is affirmative universal. So therefore it's going to be, the conclusion will be affirmative particular. Some animals are humans. And then the fourth and the final one is that the minor premise is affirmative particular, and then the major premise is negative universal. The conclusion will be negative particular. So if you said some of the students work hard, none of the students that work hard fails, the conclusion therefore is some students don't fail. So the first one was some students work hard, affirmative particular. The second one, none of the students who work hard fail, negative universal. The conclusion, some students don't fail, negative particular. Okay, so by knowing this piece of information, then you are able to go back and iterate on the other types of combinations that will not produce a correct syllogism. So, like I said in the introductory clip, rather than consuming ourselves with memorizing all of the examples, and in the longer books of logic, there'll just be examples amongst examples. And because this is just kind of maybe probably your first time you've ever taken logic, there's no point of doing that. We'll just get lost in a sea of examples. If you just memorize those 4 as examples of a correct syllogism of figure 1, anything else that looks like figure 1, a figure 1 syllogism, you'll be able to know is not logical. Now, I just want to read you a paragraph from this book, which is the same text, but it's just not in versification form. But I want to read you from the author's commentary about the order of the premises, minor versus major. So she says, with regard to mood, what we're talking about, the ashka, these are the moods of each figure. With regard to mood, it is important to highlight a significant difference in the way English and Arabic logic is often written. In English logic text, syllogisms are written in a format in which the major premise precedes the minor premise, which in turn is used to derive the mood of the syllogism. In Al-Abhari's text, which is the Isaruj, which our text that I'm reading from, my translation, is just a versification of the Isaruj. In Al-Abhari's text and other logical texts that read from right to left, because Arabic is written from right to left, the minor premise is mentioned before the major premise. Thus, if we want to translate this from Arabic into moods represented in the Latin alphabet, we must invert the major premise and the minor premise so that the major premise is first and the minor premise is listed second. This enables us to correlate the standard symbols of moods for each figure used in European-based logic texts to those in the Arabic logic text. We can see how this applies to the examples that Abhari gives in the Isaruj. So, just a technical thing, but Arabic, it's written from right to left, and there is more, what's the right word? There's more a natural flow of the logical argument for the Arabic speaker, even if they're not a native speaker. When one comes to speak or write in Arabic, it just makes sense that you'll begin with the minor, the major, then the conclusion. Whereas in English and other Western things, they begin with the major, then the minor, then the conclusion. And that's why, even though he says in the text that this is a necessary thing for the syllogism, is that the minor becomes before, of the two premises, that the minor becomes for the major, it's not necessary in the study of logic with a capital L, but it is a condition for logic in Arabic. So if you're writing in Arabic or you're responding in Arabic, and it's one of the major languages of Islam intellectual discourse, you definitely will have to put the minor before the major. If you put the major before the minor, that would be incorrect. Your point would get lost, people will openly criticize you, etc. But because we're a dual kind of language program, it's also important to note that when you read other things and other commentaries in English, it makes more sense that you put the major, then from that you derive the minor, and then therefore you derive the conclusion. And that's one of the problems. If you pick up a book like this and you don't know that, thank God she mentioned it, you can get lost. Let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, and then let's do the second kind, the second figure, which is line 90 in the poem. وَالثَّانِي أَنْ يَخْتَلِفَ فِي الْكَيْفِ مَعَ كُلِّيَّةِ الْكُبْرَى لَهُ شَرْطٌ وَقَعَ. The second has as its condition that the two premises differ as to quality, whilst the major premise is universal. So again, we have two conditions. The first condition is that the major premise is universal. And the second condition is that both the premises, the major and the minor, have to differ in quality. And the quality, we said the kaif, if one is affirmative, the other has to be negative. And then kem, we said if one is universal, other one has to be particular. So, therefore, this will generate for us another four examples for line 2, for figure 2. For figure 2, the major or the main, sorry, my language is getting messed up today. In figure 2, the example that we have, just to remember what figure 2 is that every human being is an animal. That's the first premise. The second premise, nothing from the inanimate objects are animals. Therefore, nothing from the human beings is an inanimate object. So, our chart of 4 in figure 2 will give us the following. The first example, remember we're going in the Arabic model, we're going with the minor premise, the major premise, conclusion. So the minor premise is affirmative universal, and then the major premise is negative universal. The conclusion will be negative universal. So the example is every human being is an animal. The second premise, the major premise will be nothing from the from inanimate objects is an animal. Therefore, the conclusion is nothing from the human beings is an inanimate object. So the first sentence, every human being is an animal, is affirmative universal. The major premise, the second premise, nothing from inanimate objects are animals. This is negative universal. And then therefore the conclusion, nothing from human beings is an inanimate object. This is negative universal. The second example is that the minor premise is negative universal, and then the major premise is affirmative universal. Therefore, the conclusion will be negative universal. So the example we have is nothing from plant life is a human being. The major clause, the second clause is every human being is articulate. The conclusion, therefore, nothing from plant life is articulate. So the first clause is negative universal. Nothing from plant life is a human being. And then the major clause is affirmative universal. Every human being is articulate. Therefore, the conclusion it will be negative universal. Nothing from the plant life is articulate. The third example is the minor premise is affirmative particular. The major premise is negative universal, and the conclusion is negative particular. So the first example of this is some animals are human beings. The second premise is nothing from horses are human beings. Therefore, some animals are not horses. The minor clause was affirmative particular. Some horses are animals. That's affirmative particular. And then the major clause is negative universal. Nothing from the horses are animals. Therefore, the conclusion is negative particular. Some of the animals are not horses. And then the last example is that the minor clause is negative particular. The major clause is affirmative universal. The conclusion, therefore, is negative particular. So the example we have is some animals are not horses. And I forget the English word for the horse sound. Neighing, I think. Every neighing sound is a horse. Therefore, some animals do not neigh. I hope that's the right word. I'm sorry if it's not. So the first clause, the minor clause, was negative particular. Some animals are not horses. So it's negative and particular. And then the major clause was affirmative universal. Every neighing creature is a horse, because that's the sound of the horse. Therefore, the conclusion is negative particular. Some animals do not neigh. So in this example, in figure 2, all of the major clause has to be universal. So whether it is negative universal or affirmative universal, and the second condition is that there has to be a differentiation in the quality between the two premises. If the minor premise is affirmative, then the major premise has to be negative. So when you multiply those 2 and 2 together, you get 4. That's why we have the 4 examples. And then all of the other ones outside of that do not produce anything that is an appropriate syllogism for figure 2 logic. So in English, they would say each body is formed. That's actually the major premise, and it's universal. And then the second premise in English order would be the minor premise. Nothing that is formed is eternal. So this is a negative universal. So we have the opposite. So far it's correct. Therefore, the conclusion is, therefore, nobody is eternal. So the conclusion is universal negative. Um, okay. So one thing to note, there was something I wanted to read to you guys. About figure 1 and figure 2. Um, I don't know why figure 2. Figure 2, this is reading from this book, the commentary. Figure 2 syllogisms are regarded as useful in debates to refute the arguments of adversaries because they always result in negative conclusions. They always result in negative conclusions. That's another thing that I forgot to highlight, or that we should highlight for the conditions, is that when you have we said the two conditions for the second figure is that the major premise has to be universal, and there has to be a differentiation of the qualities. So whenever you put an affirmative and a negative together, regardless if it's in the minor or the major, obviously the conclusion is going to be negative, is going to be in the negative. So she says, figure 2 syllogisms are regarded as useful in debates to refute the arguments of adversaries because they always result in negative conclusions. So that's something to keep in mind. And when you find in debates, you will find that this type of syllogism is used. I know they don't teach debate anymore in at least in American schools. I think in some European schools they still do. They don't do it in America. I did not study debate, unfortunately. But when you follow the debates and you follow people that are arguing, like Oxford Union and Speaker's Corner, all that stuff that you see online and on YouTube and things like that, you will see that a lot of the argumentation will be following figure 2 syllogisms. Okay, I'm running out of time for this clip. There's a little bit more stuff I want to read for you, so we'll do this in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, since that went a little bit faster than I had originally budgeted, let's jump into the third kind. There are 6 examples. I don't know if I can fit them all in this 10-minute clip, but we'll do the best. So let me read line 91. He says, رضي الله عنه وثالث الإجاب في صغراهما وإن ترى كلية إحداهما. The third figure stipulates that the minor of the two premises be affirmative, whilst one of them is regarded as universal. So third figure, we have these two conditions. The first condition is that one of the premises be affirmative, and one of them has to be universal. I want to give you a generic example. Let me just go back to the text. So the generic example that we gave in the last lecture was every human being is an animal, and every animal articulates, therefore some animals articulate. So we said that the conditions is that the minor of the two premises be affirmative. So the first one is, in that example, is every human being is an animal, that's affirmative. And then we said that the second is that one of them has to be universal. In this case, they're both universal. Okay, so this will generate for us 6 examples. So I'll try to go through them, but maybe a little bit quicker, if that's okay. The first example is that, remember in the Arabic we do the minor premise and then the major premise. The minor premise is affirmative universal, and the major premise is affirmative universal, like the example we just gave. Therefore, the example is going to be affirmative particular. So the example is every human being is an animal, every animal speaks, therefore some animals speak. Okay, that's the generic example that we have. The second example in our chart is that the the minor premise is affirmative universal, and so it's affirmative. We've met our first condition, and then the major premise is that it is negative universal. So the conclusion is going to be negative particular. So that we have every animal has feelings. Nothing from the animals is an inanimate object. Therefore, some things that have feelings are not inanimate objects. The third example is that the minor premise is affirmative particular and the major premise is affirmative universal. The conclusion is going to be affirmative particular. So we say some animals are horses. In the major premise, we say every animal has feelings. Therefore, some of the horses have feelings. Example number 4. The minor premise is affirmative particular. The major premise is negative universal. The conclusion will be negative particular. So we say some human beings are animals. Nothing from the human beings are inanimate objects. Therefore, some animals are not inanimate objects. Example 5, the minor clause, the minor premise is affirmative universal, and the major premise is affirmative particular. The conclusion will be affirmative particular. So we can say some things that nigh are horses, some of those that nigh race, therefore some horses race. And then example 6 is that the minor premise is affirmative universal, the major premise is negative particular, the conclusion will be negative particular. We say every human being is articulate, and then the major clause, some human beings are not scholars, therefore some that are articulate are not scholars. Now I know that some of those examples don't make logical sense in the normal sense, but they are the correctly formed syllogism. So this is figure 3. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about figure 3. Okay, so now we have done figures 1, 2, and 3. And when we look at the next sort of level of discussion, which I didn't want to get into necessarily for us, is that in figure 1 there are 4 examples, in figure 2 there are 4 examples, in figure 3 there are 6 examples. We'll come and see in figure 4 there are 5 examples. But there are a lot more combinations that can take place, but they do not yield the properly formulated logical argument. So there's a few things that we're not really doing, which is I'm not talking about those models in the charts that could be a syllogism under each figure, what we call mode, but do not yield a correctly formed syllogism. I want you just to learn the ones that do yield a correctly formed syllogism. And then there's also another level of reduction that I'm not going to talk about as well, is how you can reduce some of the more complicated syllogisms to more of the simple ones. But the important thing is, because I think for a lot of people this is going to be new-ish material, of course, I think when you hear if A equals B and B equals C and A equals C, you've all heard that, you all kind of intuitively understand that. So if you've had a normal kind of liberal arts English-based education, you will know a little bit what was going on here. But because you haven't, most of us have not actually practiced or been trained in debate, we will not know the other types of figures of the syllogism. So for me, what's important is I want you to understand that that's called a syllogism. It's made up of these two premises, and then there's a conclusion, and then there are these four figures, and then start to learn. And at this point, you just need to memorize what are the conditions for those four types of figures that we've talked about in the past couple classes, because that's what's going to be important for you moving forward. So that's what we did in the last class, which is we defined the four different figures. Let me see if I can go back to that really quickly. For you. So in figure 1 of the syllogism, the middle term is the subject of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. So you're going to memorize that. And then in figure 2, the middle term is the predicate of both premises. In figure 3, the middle term is the subject of both premises. And then in figure 4, the middle term is the subject in the minor premise and the predicate in the major premise. That's it. You just need to memorize those. If you memorize those, then when you have a syllogism in front of you, in your mind you're like, is it figure 1, 2, 3, or 4? Ah, boom, that's figure 1. I got it. And then figure 1, now you can memorize underneath figure 1 that there are these four examples that we gave. You can either memorize them in the abstract, universal, particular, affirmative, negative, or you can just memorize the silly examples that we give, and then that's it. That's what you know if it's in the chart or if it's not in the chart. That's all you need to do at this level. You don't need to do anything else because anything else would take you farther away from the initial goal. We'll put a pin in it here. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So, alhamdulillah, in today's class, lecture 13, as we're winding down our discussion of logic, we introduced a new topic, which is that each of the four figures of the syllogism, after we understand the definition of the syllogism, can produce various combinations. Over 250 possible combinations of all of the four syllogisms. But that's not the goal. The goal is not to memorize all of those, because most of those, thank God, are not correctly formed, do not yield any logical benefit. Rather, what we wanted to focus on is, in today's lecture, we did figures 1, 2, and 3. And we learned that in figure 1, there are 4 valid examples. In figure 2, there are also 4 valid examples. And then in figure 3, there were 6 examples. Anything that falls beyond those examples for figure 1, 2, and 3, they're not going to produce anything of logical value, and therefore they're not considered a logical argument, so you really don't have to worry about them. That was kind of the main thing for today's lesson. I went through each one and I gave you these examples. And then at the end, obviously there was not enough time to do figure 4, but at the end I just wanted to give you kind of my own 2 cents about all of this, which is the following, is you need to understand what a syllogism is, and then you need to understand that there are 4 types of this Iqtirani syllogism that we're talking about, and you need to learn the basic definition of figure 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then after that, you need to know, based on those definitions, in each figure of syllogism, there could be multiple types of possibilities. Not all of those possibilities, actually the majority of those possibilities, do not yield something of logical value. Therefore, you just need to memorize, like in today's lesson, the 4, and the 6, those examples. You can either memorize them by terms or memorize them by the actual examples, even if some of the examples are silly. And then therefore you will be able to determine for yourself whether something is a logical argument or not. That's really the point of the syllogism, because this is really where many people are not making sense when they speak. because they are saying something that according to the laws of logic is not a logical argument. But because no one checks them and we just get used to repeating the mistake, we just kind of keep going on and on with it. So just something for you to be on the lookout for. I know it sounds a little cumbersome, just give it some time and it will stick inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.